everyone. Welcome back to Antidotes, Stories, and Medicine. I know it has been quite a while since we last spoke, or shall I say, I spoke to you and you sat there and listened. Um, I would love to hear back from you, um, but that's a little bit hard in the podcast setting. I know I said I would be coming back with episodes in September. It didn't happen, and sometimes podcasting is hard. As Jeff Goldblum said in Jurassic Park, sometimes life gets in the way. That's the quote, right? Or something like it. I do apologize for it being such a delay. The podcast episodes are going to be coming out sporadically in the future as I get guests and I get time to edit and put them out. So I will try to be better about sending things out. But just so you know, it's still live. The podcast is still here, but it's going to be on a PRN schedule, per diem. And that'll be fine. But if you want to be on the show, if you have a great story that you want to tell, please do get in touch with me, antidotespodcast@gmail.com. Social media is also still a thing. So Instagram, Antidotes Podcast, the Facebook page and Facebook group, Antidote Stories in Medicine. Twitter. Let's talk about Twitter real quick. So over the summer, I watched the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. And I know you're all like, I don't care about this at all. I want to get to medical stories. But I had a couple glasses of wine and I was very paranoid after watching this documentary, because if you haven't seen it, it's about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how all these apps are taking your data, and how other people using the apps was allowing Cambridge Analytica to get your data, even though your friends on Facebook were using the apps. So Christine, after a couple of glasses of wine, was like, screw this, I'm getting rid of all of my social media, and briefly archived the Facebook group and tried to delete my own Twitter, but then deleted the podcast Twitter as well. So then I had to go and redo that, but I couldn't just reactivate it. It was also completely deleted. So Antidotes Pod is the Twitter, but there's nothing up there right now because I deleted it in an attempt at personal security, which online security is very important and I do recommend it. But maybe with a little bit better planning and forethought, not when you have a podcast and you're trying to promote it. Anyways, that is a PSA for the moment. I want to say thank you so much to everyone that has left reviews on my little hiatus. Every time I received one, it really inspired me to get back in and actually release this episode that I recorded in April and should have been out in June. Thank you so, so much. Specifically, Anna and April on Facebook, they left some amazing podcast reviews. Katie's Empire left an Instagram comment. There was 2 wonderful iTunes reviews from Jordan LXR and Patricia Y LCSW. Thank you guys so much. And then I got this amazing Instagram comment from Edible 1987. And I'm going to read this comment just because it was so sweet. And my boyfriend keeps mentioning this. So I think you guys should know a little bit about what's going on. So this goes back to the CO poisoning episode where we didn't listen to our detectors and they were going off and there was kind of a gas leak. Go take a listen to it. And then this comment will make a little bit more sense. So Edible 1987 wrote, I just listened to this episode. I just want you to know that the fact that smokers have more CO in their blood than non-smokers convinced me to quit smoking. Being an acute care patient tech, I have seen the end stages of COPD, and that didn't convince me. But something about having more CO in my blood scared the hell out of me, and I am now 12 hours smoke-free, and it's a bitch, but I am plugging on. And I was so amazed. I almost teared up reading that comment, and I read it to my boyfriend, and he was just like, Christine, I stopped someone from smoking. I saved someone's life. Isn't this incredible? And I was like, okay, well, why don't you go into medicine? But he keeps mentioning this. He keeps going, Christine, this podcast that I started, it stopped someone from smoking. That was 12 hours in from this person stopping smoking. Edible 1987. I really hope you've kept it up. If you haven't, that's okay. You can still quit again. Get back on the wagon. I'll keep checking in. I'll keep asking. That's just so amazing that a podcast could inspire someone to do anything, much less think about quitting smoking or try to attempt it, because that is such a huge feat and it's so good for you. But I have no idea how hard it is having never been a smoker. So I just applaud you. And I know there are so many other listeners out there that are applauding that effort as well. So good job, even for quitting for 12 hours, but I really hope it was longer and I hope it's a long-term thing. So if you have quit for the whole 8 weeks and you haven't touched a cigarette since you made that comment, please reach out. Let me know. I'm sure other listeners want to know and are wishing you well in that. Okay. So again, this episode was recorded in April and I was supposed to release it in June, but certain things came up and I wasn't able to do that. This is with Dr. Louise Aronson. She is a geriatrician and author, and she just tells these incredible stories about geriatrics and aging and how it can be such a beautiful thing. So I really want to get to it, but please reach out to me on social media. I would love to get more guests going, get everything back rolling. So let's schedule some times and hopefully we'll be able to have more episodes coming out shortly. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. Louise was wonderful to talk to. Enjoy the show. All right, so this week we have another wonderful physician author on to talk about their brand new book. This is Dr. Louise Aronson, professor of medicine and geriatrician from UCSF, which is the University of California, San Francisco. And she is here to talk about her brand new book that just came out called Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine, Reimagining Life. Dr. Aronson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It is wonderful to speak with you today.
It's a pleasure, Christine. Thanks for having me, and absolutely feel free to call me Louise.
I like to give everyone the titles they are due, especially in introductions.
Yes, no, I
be...
appreciate it, but I'm not one of those who stands on that particular ceremony. So,
well, so we can certainly be more chatty from now on.
Good.
But I hate when especially people find that women who are physicians do not get called by that appropriate title in formal situations. That drives me crazy. But tell me about your book. So I started reading this because one of the coolest perks about being an accidental podcaster is sometimes people send me books ahead of time, and I got to read it, and it's so great.
Well, I sort of feel like it is the culmination of my whole life to this point, and I'm 55 years old, so there's rather a lot. But really, my point in writing this was to do a few things. I mean, fundamentally, I think we need to change how we think and feel about aging. You tend to hear things like silver tsunami and that this is like an absolutely epic disaster, all these people who don't work. And it's just, we're full of inaccuracies, you know? So from the thing of, well, there used to be more kids and now there are more older people who don't work. In the first place, kids don't work, you know, so
right.
the balance remains somewhat the same. And actually, older people do work in increasing numbers. The fastest growing segment of our workforce is people in their 70s. And that's because, and that's sort of why I came up with elderhood, because we really have three major life phases now. I mean, it's sort of like Aristotle's 3-act play. You have childhood, which lasts, you know, like for all of these, the boundaries are vague, right? You know, so some people are very mature at 17 and there's others we know who are approaching 30 and you're really hoping that they will get on board with adulthood soon.
Maybe they will move out.
Yes, exactly. And there is a blurred line between adulthood and elderhood, but it's also really clear. Like if you were to line up an 8-year-old, a 38-year-old, and a 78-year-old, that, you know, we would all know that they were in very different phases of life, and that's okay. It makes life interesting. So I really want us to be thinking more creatively and proactively about old age, and that's within medicine and then society more generally. So I basically threw all kinds of things in there. I mean, it's part memoir because I, like most people, was a person who didn't really think much about old age or aging when I was young. And it kind of takes my trajectory from not thinking about it at all to thinking pretty negatively to thinking I was doing everything right to realizing that, you know, maybe my youthful approach had its own ageism and onward. There are tons of patient stories because I've been a geriatrician now for over 20 years. And then there's history, there's science, there's literature, there's quotes from popular culture. I really tried to show how medicine and society cannot exist without one another, and how we approach aging in one of those sectors is just inextricably intertwined with how we approach it in the other. And that makes the opportunities and the fun of it pretty great.
I was reading parts of it, of course, and I really loved how descriptive the stories were and how you painted these pictures, especially of your grandfather taking you down the hills. Was it San
San
Francisco?
Francisco,
Of,
yeah. I had the
and
best
he was kind of
grandfather.
punking you guys?
Yeah, no, he had 5 granddaughters, and he had this car with, like, a little sunroof. I mean, they were much smaller then, but he would put us on the steepest hill, and he'd take his hands off the steering wheel. We didn't understand how cars, I would have been 5 or something. I didn't know how the car
Right.
worked and that he had his foot on the brakes, etc. And we would just squeal with delight. And this was sort of between taking us out for dinner and buying us huge ice cream cones that our parents might not buy us. So he was fantastic.
And that's that youthfulness in aging
Hmm.
that you remember as a child that I think we kind of forget as we get older, that you can still be playful when you're, as an elder.
Absolutely. And I think elders know that. It's actually the people in midlife who tend to forget. I mean, most people who
Mhm.
are grandparents say it's, if not the best, one of the top 3 most fun roles of their lives. But actually, very interestingly, and very few people know this data, but in multiple polls, and this is across the world, like, so including the Gallup World Poll, there is a U shaped curve of happiness in life. So we're happy
Hmm.
in childhood, and we're really happy, like, happiness rates and life satisfaction rates start going up right about age 60, and they keep on going up. And the most unhappy, least satisfied times of life are really in our 30s, 40s, and 50s. So we have this illusion that this is the time of, power and wonder and all this sort of stuff. And yes, those people tend to control a lot in society, and they tend to be the least happy and satisfied. So we have to,
Yeah.
and one of the things I really want to do with this book is get us to tell all the stories of elderhood, the good and the bad. We discuss the bad, but all life phases have bad parts, right? But
Right.
we
Yeah.
tend to be really selective and tell only the bad about elderhood and only the good about adulthood. And the reality, I mean, in medicine, we talk a lot about evidence based medicine. Well, the evidence based reality of elderhood is that most of it is way better than adulthood.
Oh, yeah. Before I started my new job, which listeners of the podcast know all about my job change, but my prior job in primary care was half geriatrics and then half regular kind of internal medicine with middle-aged people, and I absolutely loved the geriatric half of my job. One, because I had a fabulous physician that I worked with, and he was just probably the wisest guy I've ever had the pleasure of working with. But the patients, they just have so many wonderful stories, and you get to look at life so differently when you care for people like that. And it's really a privilege to care for people in the later half of their life. I mean, I would joke around all the time with my regular patients that people in their hundreds would come in and like, how was your bridge game this week? And they're having a gin and tonic. And I'm like, you need to probably lay off that and switch out for some water because most elders don't like to drink a lot of water.
It's true.
but but they were living full lives.
Absolutely. And I'm completely an accidental geriatrician. I initially thought I'd be a pediatrician, and then I really thought I'd be an internist. Maybe I'd work with, it was sort of the height of the AIDS epidemic when I trained, and I thought I might work with AIDS patients. And what happened was, just out of the random luck of residency, I had a clinic with lots of older people. Um,
Hmm.
and I found a few things. It's true. I love stories. I did an MFA, so I obviously like writing and stories. I've always loved to read, and the way that that captures life. But so I loved their stories, but also from a medical perspective, it seemed to me the biggest, most varied and interesting part of medicine, because it really was
Yeah.
all of internal medicine and then all these age specific things. And then
Yeah.
because people are later in their lives, you can't just look at disease. You have to look at, Arthur Kleinman years ago made this distinction between disease and illness. And disease is the biological process, and the illness is how it manifests in a particular life. And with older
Mhm.
patients, you have to ask about like where are they living and who are their social supports and how is the rest of
Right.
their function. If you or I break our leg, we go in the ED and maybe they put on a brace and they tell us to make an appointment and hand us some crutches. But you're not going to necessarily do that with an 85-year-old. And so you get the privilege of knowing much more about them as a human being and then pulling together the science, the individuality, the sociocultural context. Now, to some people,
Yeah.
that is their idea of hell. They really just want to think about
Yeah.
the liver or
Right.
malaria. But if you are a person who loves people, who's primarily in the health professions because of a love of people and wanting to serve them, I mean, to me, geriatrics is the full package, and it has just been a joy. And actually, it's funny. I don't know so much about nurse practitioners or physical therapists or whatever. But about every 10 years, they do surveys of doctors to see who the happiest doctors are. And we always come out on top.
I can definitely see that. And that that approach to not just looking at disease, but looking at how health, wellness, and illness impacts the patient, their family, and the community is the fundamental tenet of being a nurse practitioner. And that is like our nursing model. And I think that is why a lot of nurse practitioners are drawn to primary care and, you know, that idea of just a lot of teaching and getting to know the patient and seeing more about them as a member of the family and the community. And nurse practitioners have very high job satisfaction rates because of it. Again, I can't speak to PAs or anything, but that's something that I know there's a lot of geriatric nurse practitioners and they just love their jobs. Like I loved it as well.
Yeah, no, we do joint trainings with our NPs at UCSF. And in fact, we've been doing this thing with the San Francisco Police Department, doing basically monthly trainings with them. And I get to work with a bunch of the NP students who are particularly interested, in Gero NP. And we just absolutely have a blast, and this is like a volunteer thing they do when already most of them are working as RNs and studying full
Yeah.
time to be NPs, and some of them actually have lives in addition to that. you know and they,
How could
I
they?
know it's actually shocking. um, but they show up and they're so enthusiastic and into it, and then you get the police officers, some of whom are kind of like, I can't believe we have to do this, and we get them all laughing and learning, and it's such a pleasure. I mean, I do think it selects for maybe happiness, or people who just enjoy
Yeah.
what they do.
It definitely gives you a greater perspective on your own life and a greater appreciation of what you can be going through, and then also it makes you less afraid of aging yourself when you see people aging well and going through life and enjoying it and realizing, oh, this isn't scary. This can be a lot of fun. I can play bridge and have gin when I'm 104.
Yeah, and I also
It's
think,
not all, death and despair.
no, it's definitely not all death and despair. And at the same time, there are these really hard parts of old age. And
Yeah.
some of that is biology, but I would actually argue that a far greater part of it is our response to that biology.
Mhm.
Because, if you think, we make life hard, we sort of like the parts of old age we dread, we essentially have created by isolating people, by not wanting to look at it, by not treating people like the full human beings they are. We have
Yeah.
expectations that are sort of crazy. And that's part of my argument in elderhood, too. That if you expect someone who's in elderhood to behave just like a person in adulthood, they will inevitably fail, right?
Yeah.
Um, but if you expect them to behave like someone in elderhood, they will succeed far better than anyone earlier in life. And that is a much more reasonable expectation. And we could avoid a lot of the loneliness and misery and some of the stuff that happens in more advanced old age if we would just really look at it and approach it with the same sort of creativity and industry that we approach all other life stages, right? All stages
Mhm.
have hard parts. So this sort of, I feel of two ways about the notions of successful aging, because if you consider successful aging doing certain sorts of things, and then we all inevitably, unless we die first, lose those abilities, then it sets us all up to fail. Whereas if you think of successful aging really as continuing to adapt, to your new realities, to enjoy life and make changes, then we can all be successful throughout our lives. One of
Right.
the stories I told in the book that I like to repeat happened years ago, probably in the 1990s. I had two women in their late 80s that I was caring for, who both had, I think, one of them had a stroke and one of them had something else, but they were suddenly both similarly unable to walk. And one
Hmm.
of them said, I'm never going out again, basically. She didn't want to be seen in a wheelchair because she thought people would think she was old and pathetic. Or, I mean, I'll just remind you,
Mm.
she was in her late 80s. So the fact that she was old was
Yeah.
not something that wasn't already obvious. Um, I mean, it always sort of surprises me when people say that, oh, but they think, oh, I'm old. Well, I think they already know. And the other one,
Yeah.
I had an appointment, and this is what I was doing house calls at the time. And she called and said, "Hey, can we reschedule?" And I said, "Yes. Are you okay?" And I'm thinking, "Oh, is she depressed?" Because I had just seen the one who was basically like taking to her apartment and not coming out anymore. And she said, "No, no, no. It's just that I'm going to the movies. And I realized with this wheelchair thing, I better get there early because I haven't done this before. And I've got to figure out where to put the wheelchair, blah, 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 blah." So we reschedule. I go see her the next week. And I say, "How was the movie?" And she says, "We have to go see it, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "How to go with the wheelchair?" And she said, "Well, it was the best. Everybody paid so much attention to me. I had the best time." And they basically, here were two people in the exact same situation. And one of them's life, if
Yeah.
anything, had gotten better. And the other one had thrown in the towel. And so to me, successful aging
Yeah.
is saying, I wouldn't in a million years ask to be in a wheelchair, but here I am. What am I going to do next? That is the difference.
Right. Just adapting to the situation and that glass half full, to use a
Yeah.
such a common, analogy. I think there's so many when you're talking about like the what we should be expecting for aging. I remember sitting in NP school and this great geriatric NP said, make sure you're asking your geriatric patients about STDs. And people kind of chuckled. And she goes, no, seriously, those older gentlemen are they're they're now widowed and they're all single, and they can have the pick of the ladies when they're going to the assisted living facilities, and they didn't have STDs when they were dating before. And we think as clinicians that they shouldn't be doing this, that they shouldn't have active sex lives, but they should. And they're not worried about getting pregnant, but we need to be making sure that we're treating them. And this is an important like health concern. And I think that was just another view of ageism, that we would not expect them to have that fullness in their lives. And it was like, oh yeah, if I didn't realize that they like they're of course they're adults, of course they're going to be having relationships after they lost their spouse. And it, it's all these things that we kind of don't reframe once someone gets past the age of 70, I think.
Right. I mean, we sort of assume that they're fundamentally different animals. And I guess what I can say,
Right.
having cared for people generally between the ages of 70 and 110 for a long time now, is that we're all exactly the same. It's actually like if you go to nursing homes, the cliquishness and the talking about people and the
Oh
group
gosh,
activities.
who sat at whose
Right. I mean,
table?
it's no difference than grade school or college. And the dating is
Yep.
just like I can remember the first time one of my parents' friends got divorced and went back on the dating scene. And, it's like, and she was in her 40s. It's just the same throughout life. People absolutely.
Hmm.
So the interesting thing about sex in late life, although I think this might be true earlier, only people are loath to admit it, is that most people are still totally into it. And some people sort of feel like, phew, I don't have to do that anymore. you know? Um,
Yeah.
but they're actually the minority. And it's more often our notions of what's right and what's wrong. So another story I love is I had a two sisters who were in their early 90s that I took care of, maybe 10 years ago now. And they would often come for their appointments together. And the one sister's
Oh.
husband had died, and the others had not. And the one who hadn't died would always bring the two sisters. And he was adorable. He always wore a vest and a hat and the whole thing. And he would sit in the waiting area. I don't know who his doctor was. Anyway, so one week, the first sister, the slightly younger one, came in, and I said, "How are you?" And she says, "Let's not talk about me. We need to discuss my sister." I was like, "Oh my goodness, what's happened?" So she says, "Well, she's having sex." And so I'm like, "Okay." And, she says, "Well, she's having sex." And I said, "Right. Who with?" I'm thinking maybe I'm missing something because
Yeah.
she was the one with the sister was the one with the husband. And so she says, "Well, with her husband." And I said, "Okay."
Yeah.
She's like, "Well, you need to tell her it's not all right. It's just, I mean, we're all in our 90s. This is, she was just completely outraged. So on and on and on. So finally, I figured like we're never going to get to any of her problems if I don't just say, "Okay, I'll speak to your sister." Okay, phew. So then, we deal with the high blood pressure, whatever else. Okay, second sister comes in, usually a very lively person, not making eye contact with me, sort of shoulders
Oh
hunched,
gosh.
sits in the chair. So I say, "How are you?" I don't get, I get a little tiny response. So I say, "So your sister talked to me," and she's nodding. And I said, "So she says you're having sex?" Nod. "With your husband?" Nod. So I say, "Are you enjoying it?" And she sort of looks up at me. And then she looks back down, nod. "Is he enjoying it?" She looks up at me again, nod. Now she's kind of looking at me. And I'm like, "Is anybody getting hurt?" Shakes her head. I'm like, "So you're both enjoying having sex and you've been married for 70 years. I just don't see there's a problem." Huge smile, up go the shoulders, and onward with the visit. Her sister was actually really mad at me, but it was
Yeah.
ridiculous. She was being cowed into feeling badly for something that was normal,
Yeah. And a
and that
great
she'd
source
been
of
doing for
exercise.
7 decades
Yep.
with no problem.
Oh my gosh. That that's
I
there's
know
so
it's
many
really
stories
so much
like
about our expectations, right?
but there's so many stories like that where people come in and they have these complaints and you're like, this is not really a problem." And like, that's okay.
Right.
You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have fun. You're allowed to be older and have fun, and that's fine. And then you totally get the patients that are in their hundreds, in their 90s, and they just don't give a damn. And they're
Mhm.
like, look, I've made it this far. I am not changing the steak and the 3 cigarettes a day, and bourbon has gotten me, to 102. I'm not
Well,
changing something. And you go, oh, okay. Like,
yeah, well, I mean, really, they're probably right. In the first place, we don't
yeah,
tend to study older people, right? So until just
right.
this past February, the NIH did not require people to study to include older adults, even when researchers were studying diseases that primarily occurred in older adults. So although there had been inclusion requirements for children, women, and people of color, for a couple of decades, it was not until 2019 that the NIH rules made sure people would include older adults. So we actually don't know if smoking matters if you're in your 90s. We don't know if statins help you if you're in your late 80s. We don't know. We don't know any of that. And frankly, if you've made it to 90 or 100 and you've been smoking for 80 years, I think you've shown a sort of genetic resilience
Right.
that like go for it. And
Yeah.
also, I feel strongly that as your life horizon is narrower, you should get pleasure wherever. I once had a son come and be outraged that his mother who was 103 was eating ice cream and she had very mild diabetes. And I was just like, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. It makes her happy. If I ever live to
Yeah.
103, which I
It
seriously
like,
doubt
who
I will,
cares at this point? Like,
I
it's
will
been
eat ice cream
103
every
years.
day if I want
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
If I
Why
go
not?
out
Or
with
even if
ice
she
cream
didn't. Like,
at
she's 103.
103,
Where do we think that's going? She should eat ice cream, for goodness sake.
please
you
let
know?
ice cream be the thing that takes me to 103. You bring up
Yeah.
a great point though about, the research and kind of a scientific, what is the word I want to use? Just kind of a bias against, old age. You said in your book that geriatrics is not even listed as a specialty. And of course, it is very much a specialty. And I was reading that and I was like, oh my gosh, it reminded me of this prior job that I was in where it was 2 doctors in private practice, and one was the geriatrician and one was an internal medicine doc. And the internal medicine doc was the reason I changed the job. And he kind of very cavalierly said one day, oh, geriatrics, it's so easy. They're just old. And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? Like that, like they have all these complaints. There's so many conditions. There's meds that are interacting with everything. There's falls. It's way harder than your patients that just want like Xanax and Adderall and like you treat their colds sometimes. Like that's way more complex. And it it's really true. I think that in the medical kind of community overall, geriatrics is really pushed to the side, and it's really unfortunate for patients and clinicians.
Right. Well, I think there are many parts to that. Part of it is
Yes, I'm
that,
sure.
we clinicians are human beings and we live in a very ageist society.
Yeah.
So naturally, as professionals, our personal ageism and norms are going to come out, right?
Yeah.
Um, I also think that sometimes clinicians who deal with adults feel strangely competitive. Like on the one hand, they'll say these patients are so hard and complex, or as the internist you referred to say, just kind of write them off. And on the other hand, they don't seem to want to acknowledge that there's a whole specialty that is happy to help them out and to either teach them how to cope with this degree of complexity, um, or to see those patients if they're feeling like it's not really in their wheelhouse. Any of those things are
Yeah.
fine. Where I feel often disappointed in colleagues is when they either pretend like age doesn't matter and often do harm as a result, or
Mhm.
look only at age as opposed to at the function or goals of the older person. Because if you have a really fit 80-year-old, their life expectancy is such that all kinds of preventive and treatment things make good sense. And if you have a
Right.
really frail one, then that is not true. Variability increases in old age. And then perhaps most disappointing of all is the people who say, well, I take care of old people all the time. You can do something all the time. It doesn't make you a specialist. I listen to people's hearts every day I'm in clinic. That does not make me a cardiologist,
Yeah.
right? I have many patients with cancer. That doesn't make me an oncologist. Um,
Right.
so, and we know from pediatrics that kids who get treated by pediatric specialists in pediatric ERs, in pediatric hospitals, have better outcomes than kids who get treated by generalists in generalist hospitals. Everything we know from the geriatric literature suggests the same is true. It sort of stands to common sense, and there's good evidence to back it up. And I feel like I had one more point about aging and something like that and how people deal with it, but I can't think what it is. So,
So you were mentioning, of course, it is important to adjust medication for the condition, as someone is aging, based on their expectancy and how they're feeling. And you had mentioned specifically Frank in the book, and how he
mhm,
was kind of the example of not aging. Well, he was the example of what people fear in aging, kind of
yes.
the gentleman who loses his wife and is then in assisted living, and you tried to make him comfortable by reducing his medication burden and helping with depression as a result of kind of this kind of bleak outlook on where he was, and also trying to get in exercise and all of these things that were still kind of this old people mill of an assisted living. What do you suggest for clinicians that are kind of facing patients like that?
Yeah, so I'm working on a sort of frank essay right now about that particular patient and the issues he brings up, really for all of us and for healthcare and society as well. So Frank was nearly 90 when I met him, and he had many, many, many medical problems. And then his wife died, and his problems were getting worse. And I was treating all of his diseases according to what we know best. Uh,
Right.
but at some point in advanced old age, right, when you're having trouble seeing and you're having trouble hearing and you're having trouble with continence and you can't really walk and you can't do basic things for yourself and your
Yeah.
diseases are managed, the management of disease becomes not so relevant. And this isn't, and for some people, they really feel like my life has run its course. I
Yeah.
do not want to be alive anymore, right? I've had a good life. Frank had a great life
Yeah.
and he'd basically had enough, and yet there he was still alive. So
Yeah.
this is actually a reality that is largely constructed by the medical advances, particularly in the second half of the 20th century and in the current century. So we have created this situation that we all dread and don't want to be in. Now there are some people who want to be alive no matter what.
Hmm.
Sometimes this has to do with religion. Sometimes it just has to do with who they are as people. In my experience, they are a minority once you get to the true extreme of old age, where there's no amount of care or love or whatever else that is really going to correct the things that are depriving people of their agency, their meaning, their purpose, their hope. I
Yeah.
don't know that that's depression. That may be an accurate assessment of a really, really extreme life phase.
Hmm.
And to say that a person who wants to be dead, who's in their 90s and all organ systems are not really functioning and we have no hope to offer them of any of them getting better. To say that that person wanting to be dead is equivalent to a 50-year-old who just lost his job wanting to be dead, or a 24-year-old who's just had a breakup wanting to be dead, I think is wrong, right?
Right. Yeah.
They are at a
Absolutely.
very different phase of life. And even within elderhood, it's really different to be that older person and to be a 77-year-old whose spouse just died who's feeling depressed.
Yeah.
Those are really different deaths to me. And I think we need to explicitly and carefully think about if we have engineered basically this advanced old age that most people don't want to be alive in.
Yeah.
What are we going to do to help people once they reach that situation?
Yeah.
And I don't know what the right answer is. It obviously puts you on a bit of an ethical slippery slope.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I would argue we are already on an ethical slippery slope, having engineered this future and then abandoning people into the misery of it. So, at the very least, we need to start having these conversations. And I think that will make the worst of old age so much less scary and onerous for all of us. So, people see it as like this horrible, hard thing. And yes, it's hard, but hard isn't necessarily horrible. And I think we could really make a difference here if we can just have these sincere conversations and make the end as good as everything that leads up to it. I really believe we can do that, but we have to start by talking about it.
It's definitely a very difficult conversation, but having worked in geriatrics and also done long-term care as part of that practice, we would round in the assisted livings and nursing homes. You see those patients that are medically complex but stable with their CHF and diabetes and everything else, or those cancers that are just those lingerers. They're not going to take them, but they're just hanging on, and you're like, what do we do now? If we keep these meds, or even if we don't, they're going to be around for another couple of years, but this person is just, they've had enough. They've run their course, and it's like
Absolutely.
having too much ice cream. After a little while, it's just, you don't want any more, and there's no point if no one else is around enjoying it with you. And so your heart kind of just breaks as you see these people, usually in an assisted living, surrounded by the memories of their life that once was, that made them happy. And I think almost seeing all of that makes it a little bit worse, because they're just kind of just reflecting on everything that they used to have. And again, I don't know the answer, but talking about it certainly is at least doing something. That is not always the case. I mean, that's not a common thing. I'm not sure how to say how common it is. I shouldn't speculate on that, but it's something to be concerned about as far as the conversations of aging.
Definitely. And I think we put people, segregate them into these warehouses so that we don't have to look at what we fear most, what we find tragic. And they too find it tragic. So
Yeah.
Judy Graham, who writes great things on aging, mostly for Kaiser Health News these days, had a piece a couple weeks ago, definitely in April, about suicide rates in long-term care facilities. And
Hmm.
more people are just saying, I don't want to live this way, and then killing themselves. One of the problems with that solution is that, suicide does all kinds of collateral damage to families, right? Who
Yeah.
feel like, oh my God, we didn't make his or her life worth living. Um, I also think a person who's really at their end of their life shouldn't have to resort to that, that we should be able to offer them other options.
Yeah.
And you probably have to do it sooner than you might, because I feel like the people who really would rather not be here any longer no longer have the ability to kill themselves either.
Yes.
So there's all kinds of problems, and those problems all stem from the fact that we don't acknowledge that the extremes of elderhood are absolutely different and unique life situations that need different and unique solutions.
Yeah. To change topics to something that is a little bit more hopeful about elderhood.
Yes, well, and that's the extreme and the minority, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear, I think you're just right. Before that are
Yes.
decades, which are, as we said earlier, the happiest ones of most people's lives.
Yes. It's a very important topic that I think we see as clinicians and we should be discussing because I think everyone is very afraid of that. But
Hmm.
also, it's really important to talk about how wonderful it can be for people. And always had patients that were coming and saying, "Oh, I went to my dancing class or something." They're always doing activities, and that was something I was always encouraging people to do because stride length was a big indicator of fall risk. There were some studies with that. But
Hmm.
what other things do you encourage your patients to do that are not pharmacological to increase their longevity, increase their strength, their happiness, to really get the most out of those years?
Yeah. Well, I think it's actually sort of ironic that we badmouth elderhood, but in adulthood, we're always saying, "Oh my God, I don't have enough time to work out as much as I want. I don't have enough time to go see that movie, to stream that movie. I don't
Yeah.
have enough time to read that book. I don't have enough time to see my friends. Oh, I'd like to go see this country. I'd like to go do that.
Yeah.
Oh, I would volunteer. Isn't that organization cool? I would love to do that." And
Yeah.
in elderhood, that's what your days are comprised of. Like all those things that we're all saying we never have time to do, that
Yeah.
we so want to do. And we spend all our adulthood complaining, like, I wish, I wish, I wish. And then elderhood, you get to do those things.
Yeah.
What a person likes is so personal.
Yeah.
But there is no question that the single best medicine, sort of for both mental and physical health, for heart disease management and prevention, for cancer prevention, for diabetes prevention and management, possibly for dementia, for basically, everything you can think of is exercise and activity.
Mhm.
And so for some people, exercise is just like this, oh no, 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 no. But what I like to say is exercise is any kind of physical activity that really gets you moving. So if what you like to do is walk, or what you like to do is look at buildings, walk and go look at those buildings, right? If you
Yeah.
like to dance, dance is a fantastic form of exercise. It's
Yeah.
also social, you get music. If there's so many different ways people can stay active and fit. And that's probably the single most important thing. If you can do it in a social context, I'd say that's a twofer.
Yeah.
Eating well, we tend to think of eating well as one of those things also, that you do preventatively. It's increasingly clear with all this stuff on sugar addiction. And let me just be clear to the audience that I say this as a sugar addict myself who suffers from recidivism. We have a visiting 19-year-old currently, and there's a lot of ice cream. And every day I pledge to be a better person in midlife, and every day I fail. So I totally understand how hard this is. And yet, I think we all know that when you eat less sugar, and lots of the good, colorful, fresh things that the world has to offer, unless you happen to live in a food desert,
Yeah.
then you feel better, you have more energy, you sleep better, all those things. And that's no less true in elderhood. So I really think that the three key things, or maybe the four key things, are, activity, social engagement. It's clear that loneliness and social isolation kill. They're like
Yeah.
15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
So physical activity, social engagement, nourishing your body, good food, good sleep, and then And then really like thinking what gives your life meaning and purpose, right? Having something to get up for every day makes a huge difference in the quality of a person's life at all ages. So find something you love and go for it. It can be working on that old car that's been without tires in your front yard for 40 years. It can be volunteering with the cute kids that keep walking by your apartment building. It can be so many things. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters that it makes you happy and then it gives you a great reason to get up in the morning.
Yeah. That's a very optimistic and I think more realistic idea, or not even idea, but description of what people really are doing as they're aging. I would always ask people, "Oh, what have you been up to?" And you get these wonderful stories of just what they're doing, especially when you get the couples. My favorite part is talking to the couples that have been married forever,
For
and
so
you
long, for like
so
twice as
so
long as
long.
you've been alive or something.
Yes. Yeah, and getting to give them, like, good medical news. I can think of, like, one in particular, like, it just makes me tear up thinking about it, and just to asking them about how long they've been married and what they like to do together, and, like, that is their activity, just being together, and you go, "I don't know how you do it." But it's so wonderful to see that socialization and the individual, stories that come from that.
Right. And also you can just, if you think of who's leading this country right now, the leaders in Congress, a bunch of the leading presidential candidates, a bunch of the people on the Supreme Court, a bunch of the people who lead the biggest organizations, whether it's Hollywood um, or maybe a little less in tech, obviously, but big biopharma companies, big hospitals, most of those people are in their 60s, 70s, and sometimes 80s. So, this notion that everybody retires and that that's what elderhood is actually increasingly false. It's that thing of being active, engaged, and doing something purposeful. It turns out work is what does that for most of us most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, and so, for those of us who are fortunate to have interesting careers, most people really don't want to retire, or they
Yeah.
retire and then they unretire. And they do something, admittedly, usually not the 60 hours a week that most of us work in adulthood, um, but sometimes that much. And take up second careers doing all kinds of things. And it's also true, though, that for people on the lower half of the income ladder, they often need jobs to have more money because people are retiring earlier but living longer and you can run out of money. So to find a job that's fun, like I travel a lot and I get a lot of, Uber drivers, shuttle drivers, and people like that who are in their 70s and 80s and loving it because they just spend the day chatting with people. They make extra money. They go around town. It's terrific. So there's so many ways to be old. The limit is really a person's imagination. And then, of course, as at all ages, their finances.
Yes. Yeah, and having that part-time job that is a fun job can help with the finances, but also keep you socially engaged and active too. I mean, look at RBG. She's a hero for many people, and she was in that video where she's lifting weights and doing push-ups and
I
everything, and
know. I love that movie.
it was just an amazing example of badass aging with
Yep.
her kyphotic spine.
Yeah. I mean, you look at her and you think, like, oh, that, she couldn't do any of those things, but she does. So we're just wrong in our assumptions more often than not.
And she's beat pancreatic cancer like twice, I think.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's also some people who are exceptional, like don't try this at
Exceptional in
home. Sort of
exceptional in every
in
way.
every
Yes.
possible way. Yeah, no, she's
Yeah.
sort of the fourth dimension, but I think there's also a lot that those of us who live in the third dimension can do.
Yeah, or at least attempt to approach that level of
Exactly.
inhumanity, superhero state.
Yeah.
So what else about your book would you like to touch on before we wrap up?
I guess the last thing is, as I said earlier, I trained as a fiction writer. So
You can
the
tell in the book. It's
okay, good. I was going to say so. The Nobel Literature Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer was once asked, "What is the point of literature?" And he said, "Number one is entertainment, and number two is education."
mm,
So my goal was really to reach that level that it should be an enjoyable read, and all the feedback so far is that it is. Although I suppose If people found it wasn't, they might not tell me. But really, the point was to entertain first and to educate second. And then, of course, the big goal is to change how we think and feel about aging so we can all really look forward to it and really enjoy it.
Well, I think for listeners of this podcast, where it is stories in medicine, antidote stories in medicine, you tell a bunch of stories, and everyone here loves stories. So the stories were beautifully written, very descriptive, and I certainly felt like I was in the car with your grandfather
Great.
teasing us down the hill, and then hearing Frank's story as well was just absolutely devastating. And I was almost tearing up as I was reading that amongst all the other ones too. So it was very well written, and I'm sure everyone else will love it when they read it. Well, let everyone know where they will be able to find you and your book and where your website is.
Okay, so you can find me. My website is www.louisearonson.com, and there you can find how to order the book. You can find where to find me on Twitter and Instagram. You can find all my appearances on television and live, hopefully in a city near you. You can request that I come if I'm not already coming, and you can buy the book really anywhere, from Amazon to your local bookseller.
Local booksellers are great, and Amazon is super convenient. And that book is Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine, and Reimagining Life by Dr. Louise Aronson. Thank you so much again for taking time out to speak with me about this book. This was so much fun.
Thank you, Christine. I had a great time too. It was terrific to speak to you.